Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. Our guest author today is Joanna Bogle, author of A Nun with a Difference, The Life and Letters of Sister Mary Alban, FC, published by Sun Hill Publishing. Joanna, always wonderful to have you here.
It's always jolly nice to be here.
Great to have you on this side of the pond, as they say.
Thank you.
And people early this year would have seen when you were on with Father Mitch.
Yes, I had a happy
At that
time.
time, you got to talk about, at that time when the Holy Father had visited in England and in Scotland, and how important that was to what's going on in the church. And here's something that's a nun with a difference. Now, we have a great affinity here for nuns, obviously, because our foundress and our wonderful sisters. Who is this nun with a difference? Her name is Sister Mary Alban, FC. What's the connection to you and to her? And in reading the book, it's an interesting story, but doesn't seem to be Mother Teresa, and she wasn't burned at the stake or something for defending the faith. So what's the interest here?
What's the story? I got interested in this story in a most extraordinary way. I got a letter out of the blue from somebody who was an Anglican lady who was the next door neighbour of a Catholic friend, and she said that this Catholic friend had suggested I wrote to her because she wanted somebody to help her produce a book about a wonderful auntie of hers who was a nun. Well, you get these letters, frankly, as a Catholic journalist. People write to you and they say, my auntie was wonderful, or I've got a wonderful idea for a novel. Why don't you write the book?
Right.
Dear Mrs. Bogle, why don't you write the book? I've got the idea.
Especially if the Lord has put it on their heart to get in touch with you.
That's it. Right. And sometimes they're sitting next to you at a dinner party.
Okay.
They've got this wonderful idea for a book. Why don't I write it? So I started.
And it may even be a wonderful idea.
Indeed.
But
Exactly. Sometimes it is. But so I started, even before I'd finished reading the letter, I started to compose in my head the reply. Dear Lady Lowe, thank you so very much, but I'm busy, many projects. When I got to the end of the letter, I suddenly realized I knew this auntie of hers. I knew exactly who she was. This was Sister Mary Alban, who had been headmistress of my old school and was, at the time I was at the school in the 60s and early 70s, was a legend. She was a legend, and she had really created the school in its modern form. And I thought, how funny, because, there are 57 million people in Britain, and here is this niece of my former head.
Did they realize there was that connection?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
All that Yvonne, this lady's next door neighbour, had known was that here is Helen Lowe wants to have a book about her auntie. Joanna might help,
Okay, sure.
And I thought that was too much of a sort of coincidence. So I wrote back and said I could be interested. And at that stage, I thought there probably won't be a book in this, but maybe I could write a feature article for a Catholic paper. Because Helen Lowe, Lady Lowe, had all Sister Mary Alban's letters and diaries and so on. And I thought, well, we might have a nice afternoon, rummage through these, and I get a feature out of it. Then when we met, I realised there was a book in it. This was an extremely remarkable woman, and I and many, many other women had, in a sense, benefited from what she'd achieved. It's not Mother Teresa, it's not burning at the stake, it's the story of many other nuns who did the same, working quietly, bravely, and in a very solid way in education. And so many of us owe so much to nuns.
Why do you think that's an important part of understanding the faith, especially today for people?
I think one of the things we don't realise is that, first, the enormous achievements of some nuns in the church. Yesterday, today, and I'm sure it's going to happen tomorrow. Sometimes it's very dramatic, like Mother Teresa, or people who work with lepers or something. And we're seeing new developments like the Sisters of the Gospel of Life, meeting new challenges. Right. But one of the things nuns have done, particularly in the recent past, was educate women. And this is something we need to discuss, because the church is often accused of being anti-women, and this is nonsense. And you
point out the fact, because I was thinking, I read it, I always think of the sisters and how much Catholic education owes to them, but I always think it more in, guys and girls going to school together. But you're saying specifically educating women.
Yes, St. Philomena's in Carshalton, where I went, which is still a fine Catholic school, although it's no longer run by nuns, it's now a diocesan school. When it was founded by the Daughters of the Cross, it's on the outskirts of London, but when it was founded in the 1890s, it would have been really more rural. London hadn't spread out to it. There's a railway station, but it was really a village then, and it's in a most beautiful old house. Once one of the great houses locally, a beautiful Queen Anne mansion, beautiful grounds. Sir John Fellows lived there. And it was acquired by the nuns, and they ran it initially as a very exclusive boarding school for girls, very expensive. And in those days, the Empire, British Empire, so girls would lived there when their parents were serving in India or Africa, and it became their second home.
So was that typical that when people were serving like in the military or the Foreign Office or something like that?
Yes,
Is that what it would
particularly in colonial
So
service.
they wouldn't actually, the children wouldn't go? Or?
Well, yes, I mean, it would take about, I don't know, however long,
Right.
3 or 4 weeks to get to India, so it
Right.
wouldn't be worth it. And what was sad is that sometimes they were almost estranged from their parents for 2 or 3 years because they didn't. So in a way, a boarding school like that, I mean, it's a different Britain, different world.
Right.
And it wasn't very academic. It was rather an exclusive school and quite small. And what the girls were having was a lovely life in the country, very devout Catholic faith, and academic, but not public exams. You weren't going to go to university. And then the world changed after the First World War. Everything was different. And what Sister Mary Alban achieved was to transform that school into a big, effective modern girls' school in which you took public exams and could go to university. And by the time people like me arrived, and I was at school in the 60s, she had already moved on then. We'll talk about her wonderful work in India.
Right.
But she'd already created that kind of a school, and it went through other changes. But here was the church keeping pace with the life of the 20th century and educating women with the unchanging truths of the faith, which they're still teaching at St. Philomena's in the new context of, again, another very different Britain, different from when I was at school. But the faith doesn't change, but the context changes. And girls now have careers, they need public exams. And today you have to teach girls things that at one time you wouldn't have needed to, like abortion is very wicked, which would have, you wouldn't even mention the word, I think, 100 years ago.
We just understood.
It was just understood.
Right.
So you need to change, and then there are things that don't change. And Sister Mary Alban was living through times of immense change for women in the 20s and 30s. And instead of thinking, well, we're running a nice little boarding school, she thought, no, you have to educate women for today and tomorrow. And she did, and the school became a very well-known one. And also the class structures were changing. She didn't want to run a school for the daughters of some rich people and colonial servants and so on, who were not necessarily rich but had a certain lifestyle. It was for all the middle-class girls, all the local Catholic girls, the daughters of the local doctors and dentists and tradesmen and just people. And also you could pass a scholarship and go to the school for free. She was switched on to what tomorrow needed.
Right. Is that why you say this is a story of a woman who grew up in the last decades of the 19th century, that it has much to say to us as we face the challenges of the 21st century?
Yes.
What do you see the challenges? Are those for the church, for Catholic education, specifically in England, worldwide?
Yes, for all of these. It's much discussed, and I've, among other Catholic churches, have discussed it, that Catholic education has been through very rough times, particularly since the 1970s. You remember it was all fashionable that you shouldn't teach the faith at all, just let the children experience joy and all that kind of drivel. Well, that's changed. I think we now have a more vigorous approach, and we now need to re-educate teachers, give them back a confidence. The new catechism is a gift to the church, and we need to teach the faith. Sister Mary Alban really believed in teaching the faith. And we've been through some difficult times, but certainly in Britain, Catholic schools are very popular. They're oversubscribed. Parents do anything to get their children into them.
Why?
Well, because even though they may not always be teaching the faith brilliantly, they're teaching something. They have a sense of community, they talk about God, and also the academic standards are good. Also, because you have to be a Catholic to send your children there, there's some kind of commitment. They're government funded. St. Philomena's is now government funded. It's certainly not
Do the sisters still run that school?
No,
or?
not anymore.
Were they running it when you were there?
They were running it when I was there.
Okay.
And we had a number of lay teachers too. And because of the changes in the religious life, and we know, the whole of religious life is changing, and we lost a lot of sisters in the turmoil of the post-Vatican II years and so on. I actually can see, though, that St. Philomena still very much has the spirit that Sister Mary Alban wanted, very much so. They're very proud of their heritage, and they've, in fact, in recent years, even more, they like to have pictures of the 1920s and 30s, really emphasize, which was not happening in the 70s, really emphasize a link with the past, concept of heritage and tradition. And that's a very Catholic idea. We're proud of our past. And there may be things that look absurd at some of the girls, particularly in the 1930s, when you have to see pictures of social occasions with women in these funny hats and so on. But some things don't change, and the faith doesn't change. And I think if Sister Mary Alban came back today to see St. Philomena's, she'd see things she didn't approve of. She'd tick off the girls who were shrieking or laughing loudly or something like that, or being vulgar, or loud pop music. She'd see things she did approve of. And if she saw them singing hymns at morning assembly and praying together, she'd think, yep, absolutely.
That's a good thing. Now, in chapter 1, right at the beginning, there's a reference here to Sister Mary Albin's personal anthology. And here's one quote I thought, "There is no knowing where God might call us." And sometimes I wonder when that's very true, but I think sometimes people today are afraid of that. They're afraid if they listen, they might hear God calling them to do something they really don't want to do.
Yes, I think I'm in that category. One of the things that impressed me about Sister Mary Albin was this is an extremely intellectually gifted woman. She was the first generation of women who could go to university. In fact, she did it by correspondence. She was not brought up a Catholic.
And wasn't she trained basically to be a doctor, or was going to be a doctor,
yes,
right?
She's very interesting, you see, because God called her to do things that she wasn't expecting. We're talking about a Victorian childhood, rather an unhappy one. They're a very big family, and her mother hated having children, and as soon as they were born, gave them to foster parents. It seems unthinkable, doesn't it, to us?
Right.
It's awful, but she just didn't like her children, and they were a very large family. Some of the children died, and they were brought up rather brutally. Mother didn't care for them at all, and they had a series of nannies. They were not properly fed, horrid food. And then later in life, after her mother died, which happened when she was a teenager, and she didn't even grieve for her because they really hardly knew their mother, these children nevertheless formed a little tough band, and a number of them ended up as Catholics. It's rather impressive.
Right.
But they were well educated, and she wanted to train as a doctor and was the first generation of women who could do that. And then she gave it all up when she had the call to be a nun, even though she was very nearly qualified. And to have got into medical school as a woman at the Royal Free Hospital, to be training as a woman doctor in London, in those years before the First World War, when women were fighting for the vote, you have a very determined young woman here. Then she became a nun, completed her degree by correspondence at London University, became, as I've indicated...
Because nuns wouldn't go to class.
Nuns would not go to lectures or anything in those days. And she was a very intellectual woman, spoke beautiful and fluent French. And then finally, her great
So she had been in Belgium, right?
She was educated in Belgium,
right.
By nuns, even though her father was not a Catholic and had no time for the church
Right, this
at all.
I thought was interesting. You make the comment, their father's lack of any religious belief was also something that would, in later years, draw many of them into the church. That seems counterintuitive.
Yes, but if you look at the context, you see they had this rather grim Victorian upbringing. The family were very well-to-do, rather grand, but very bleak. You know, you were stuck in the nursery at the top of the house. And I think the lack of love, particularly from her mother, was associated in her mind with a lack of knowledge of God. And what she met in the nuns when she went to school in Belgium was affection. She writes rather sweetly about her younger sister. The first night was weeping because she was frightened and lonely and one of the nuns tucked a little sweetie under her pillow, isn't that sweet? So you know, and I have to say, having gone to a convent school myself, my memory is the nuns were on the whole very kind.
Right.
They could be stern and all that, but they were also kind, you know.
Right.
They were brisk and hearty, but kind, and also sometimes very amusing, and they told you funny stories, and, you know, they made things fun.
Well, did you ever have the experience you listened to someone who you went to school with recount and regale these terrible stories of how tough the sisters were, and you sit there and say, what school did you go to?
I've had exactly that experience. When we get together, and I don't do this very often, with the women I was at school with, sometimes there's this desire for people to be fashionable. All the nuns were terrible. And I have to keep saying, listen, it was the 1960s. We were growing up with pot and a pill. Right. And our education was in that context. The nuns knew exactly what was going on in the world. And my memories of school were fun. And the idea the nuns were brutal, that was rubbish. The only thing I found really horrible was lunch, and that was not provided by the nuns, but by the local county council, and it was simply revolting. But my memory was, you know, fun. And
Did that inspire you to learn how to cook then?
Yeah, that's why. I mean, if you once eaten London Borough of Sutton tapioca pudding, And I remember the nuns and the other Catholic staff as being intelligent, well-educated women who were what we would today call role models, rather good. And certainly there were some who were peevish. And I do think our attitude to the nuns was slightly that none of us wanted to be nuns. We thought, well, that's their generation. We had so many more opportunities. I mean, when I was at school, all the new jobs were opening up to girls. You could be a barrister. Within years of my leaving school, we had a woman prime minister, which when I was a little girl would have been completely unthinkable. So we did tend to see the nuns who educated us as the last generation of women for whom there were more limited possibilities and also whose lives had been constricted by 2 world wars. But we, on the whole, it was a happy relationship. We liked them. We had a lot of laughs. We had a sixth form pantomime when you could laugh at the staff, you could dress up about them, you could imitate them, you got away with it. And I'm not sure that would have been true in our local other schools. There was something about the nuns that was fun. They were often stern, and occasionally they were unjust to you. It happens. I mean, even your own parents sometimes punish you when you didn't deserve it because there's a misunderstanding. And yet you know you love each other, and good heavens, the punishments were always very mild. I mean, I remember at school you lost points for your house or something, but nobody locked you up on bread and water.
Right.
There was a lot of fun and laughter.
Now, what's interesting, too, is that Sister Mary Alban also had a sister, Dorothy, who became Sister Mary Campion, at least initially, right? But she didn't stay.
She didn't. It's interesting. Sister Mary Alban, Gladys was her original name. She took the name Alban because St. Alban is the proto-martyr of northwestern Europe, our first martyr in Britain. And her youngest sister Dorothy, who adored Gladys, followed her into the convent and took the name Campion, after Edmund Campion. So you have these very ardent women, you know, we're going to reconvert England, we're taking the name of these former martyrs, St. Alban, St. Edmund Campion. And it's quite clear that Dorothy wasn't really cut out for that life at all, and she subsequently left the convent. And I think it's interesting because in more modern times we've seen a number of nuns leave and we think it's a modern thing. Well, it's not entirely. It has happened before. And the only thing that was, I think, a little cruel in the church of those days, it was quite difficult to leave the convent. They made her delay for a couple of years. I think that was rather silly. It would have been better to say, well, there's no lock on the door.
Right.
You know, when you feel that you've really, and as it was, she chafed and chafed as some paperwork went on. It was very bureaucratic in that time, very cold, and I think that caused her unnecessary distress, and it certainly muddled her because for the next few years she wasn't sure what to do. But eventually she married. She had a little girl who went as a pupil to St. Philomena's. So there was a happy ending to that story.
Well, what was nice about it too is, you know, contrary to kind of some of the stuff that sometimes you get today, which is, you know, it was a situation where it didn't turn out that really wasn't her vocation. And she went and found what her true vocation was, and she lived out her faith as a Catholic, and she wasn't there complaining about the church or...
And I met the daughter, Penelope, who is now an old lady, and she was instrumental too in urging me to do this book, and we had a very jolly lunch and so on. She herself, of course, an old lady. And all the family are very, very proud of Sister Mary Alban, their Aunt Gladys, or now Great Aunt Gladys, and so on. And there is a very strong pride. Not all the family, of course, are Catholic, because some of the brothers and sisters of this large family did not convert, but they all united in this immense affection for this nun. And Penelope in particular, who was taught by her, absolutely loved her. And it's a very exciting story in a way, because out of this extraordinary, rather miserable Victorian nursery of a grand but rather chilling family, you get this nun who ends up going to India after St. Philomena. Went to India, founded a college there, which thrives to this day in what is today Pakistan, the major Catholic women's college, and that's a wonderful thing in an Islamic state. How extraordinary. What an extraordinary story. You know?
And it was interesting, too, because I know there was, here on page 53, there was some tension about the teaching of religion, a compulsory subject for all public examinations, including university degrees. Sister Mary Alban did not want Islam taught in her Catholic college.
I don't know exactly how that was finally resolved, but I would put my money on Sister Mary Alban there, rather than, this was when Pakistan was first being created after 1947 and the partition of India. Newly independent Pakistan was to be an Islamic state, and her college was going to be in Pakistan. And interestingly, she was very sympathetic to Pakistan in the sense that she wanted to work with the people, make a go of whatever was happening, but she really was not prepared to run a Catholic college, which would end up being an Islamic college. So she made it clear it was dedicated to St. Joseph and it would be Catholic. And it's interesting that by quiet persistence, she certainly established it as a Catholic college. They didn't have, the Islamic rule there. I don't know exactly the minutiae of how that worked out year on year, or indeed exactly how it works out today. But the church has to be quietly firm. We will teach the Catholic faith, and that is what we will do.
Now, when you went to St. Philomena's, did you play field hockey or lacrosse?
Lacrosse.
Okay.
One of the things that happened was that, as I've indicated, Sister Mary Alban took on this rather exclusive boarding school. But the nuns had also recently founded a day school for girls, and what she did was to merge the two. And the girls' school, the day school had played hockey, and the boarding school had played lacrosse. So she decreed we will all just play lacrosse. And that's what I played. Actually, I loathed it. It was bitterly cold, and you ran around on an icy field I was no good at it. And I have to say, I'm not sure Sister Mary Alban would entirely have approved of me. I loved school, and I owe the nuns and the school a lot. But I do remember, frankly, furtively skipping off lacrosse lessons and having a quiet cigarette and a gossip. And I mean, that was terribly wicked and so on. And I remember climbing over the wall to go out and get sweets and so on, and climbing back in again. I'm not sure I was a model pupil, but I was very happy there. And when I go back, I'm very much the old girl who's proud of the school.
So that's a nun with a difference, okay? And now we also have in closing moments, we wanted to tie into obviously what a lot of people, certainly on EWTN, connect you with, which is Feasts and Seasons, your television program, which you're here taping and taped, 12 new episodes?
Yes, and in fact, originally it was meant to be just Advent to Christmas and then Lent to Easter, but I decided to stretch it backwards. So I'm looking at things that Catholics need to know about: harvest traditions, praying for the dead in November, and then Advent, and then the New Year, Hogmanay, Feast of St. Sylvester, Candlemas, Lent, Easter.
Right. Now, to tie into that, there's a couple of little books that that you've put out and we have available: Advent and Christmas, Catholic Customs and Traditions, and Lent and Eastern Catholic Customs and Traditions. Now, are these directly tied in, or are they tied into the series?
They are. They don't include recipes. These are published by the Catholic Truth Society in London, and they are explaining our Catholic traditions.
Publisher that we work with over there.
Yes, right? they're wonderful, the CTS. Right. They've been going for over 150 years, teaching the Catholic faith. And these booklets explain our Catholic customs and traditions, but they don't include, recipes and so on. Right. They explain some of the beautiful traditions we have in church and also how we can do nice things at home. But they're not exactly, here's how you make a hot cross bun. I mean, you don't need to put that in a booklet. Yeah. But yes, they would absolutely accompany my cookery series.
Well, this is the one, looking quickly through the Advent and Christmas, the Advent wreath as wedding ring. I had never heard that.
Well, yes, there is this idea, you see, of a circle, which goes on forever, so a ring is like that. And the whole idea of the Advent wreath, it's not a bar of 4 candles in a row, it's eternity, and that's linked to our wedding ring idea. And the crown. One of the things I like about the Catholic faith is that it's all a unity. It is a garment woven without seam. So something which we have as a symbol of one thing will echo again and again in another. I think it's rather like, in a way, the thanksgiving we have for the harvest and for wheat and bread, but your mind immediately does leap to the Eucharist. So in a sense, it's as if God is saying everything is one, and you should explore this beautiful world that I've given you, because many quite small things will make you think about larger things.
Right, and not necessarily withdraw from it.
Yes.
The other one that I always think of with you is Boxing Day. As opposed to pugilistic experiences. Boxing Day, it has something to do with gifts and presents?
Yes, it simply means the boxes that you put presents in. It's the name we in Britain give to St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas. And it simply means boxes, presents are in boxes. When I was a little girl, you gave a Christmas box to people who'd helped you through the year. So the local postman would get his Christmas box, and the milkman...
He would get that on the day after Christmas?
Well, in theory, but in practice you didn't. You gave him his Christmas box usually a week or so before Christmas. Okay. In fact, that is slightly fading now. And I remember, though, when I was a little girl, that the postman and the dustman who collected your rubbish, and the milkman in the days when we had milk delivered, which we don't anymore, they would sometimes come in for a Christmas box because the Christmas box included a glass of sherry. But I don't think they could have done that at every house, or they'd have been under the table. Right. But our local postman, when I was a little girl, I remember my father invited him in for a Christmas box, and in those vanished days, it was tobacco. He gave him a little gift of tobacco. Really? Yeah. But he was so kind, that postman, because when it was a birthday in our family, he would see there were cards addressed to a child, and he would walk very slowly, I can see this happening now, slowly past the house, shaking his head, no letters, and then do a big theatrical, there were letters after, knowing that there were children waiting at the window.
Really? Oh, okay.
And I remember that because that's kind, isn't it, to an excited little boy and girl watching at the window. And I remember when it was my brother's birthday, Barbara, my sister, and me saying, I don't think we've got any cards, Andrew. And so he thought all the aunties and uncles had forgotten. But no, I know it sounds silly, but that's worth a Christmas box, isn't it?
Right, definitely.
You can see why my mother and father, knowing that this man had given pleasure to their little ones, wanted to give him a present.
Well, there was more opportunities for more personal connections than when the postman drives by in the thing and throws it into your...
It's all different now, isn't it? And somehow as well, the relationships, there was perhaps an element of being patronizing, I don't know. But there were warm human relationships, and I think we forget that at our peril. We still say Boxing Day, and you do open boxes on Boxing Day because you don't open all your presents on Christmas Day. If Grandma and Grandpa come on the day after, you're opening the presents then. And I believe quite strongly that children today who get so many presents, one solution to that, part of this, is to open them not all on Christmas Day. Otherwise, sometimes more modest gifts get ignored on Christmas Day.
Right.
I know it's a silly thing, but it's not trivial. And also, what about giving to other things? Boxing Day is a nice day for visiting some old people and giving them a box of something
And we also
nice.
know that when you have a lot, you don't appreciate it as much as when you have a little. And the other thing I thought, just before we go in the Lent and Easter, that Lent is a word of Saxon origin.
It's the same root word. The days are lengthening.
Okay.
Somebody once told me that once you get onto the origins of words, etymology, you really begin to come to God. And I know it sounds funny, but as soon as you explore language, you get to God.
Interesting.
The word.
All right. Well, what's your hope for your series, your upcoming series?
I would really like it if we could bring the faith alive. I think Sister Mary Alban would approve of that.
That's great. A great way to end this program. Talking to the one and only Joanna Bogle. Great to have you here. Joanna talking as an author about her book, A Nun with a Difference, The Life and Letters of Sister Mary Alban. And that's published by Sunhill Publishing, available through our religious catalog, as is these two books on Lent and Easter and Advent and Christmas. Check them out. Check us out next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.